Good evening and most welcome to H784. And tonight I will talk about space and how getting closer to space will make you more aware, balanced and equilibrial. And what made me this idea was something I heard the other day. I asked some people to imagine space and somebody said, or think about the space around them, and somebody said, well, yeah, I'm going to imagine something instead because I don't know how it looks, or I'm going to keep my eyes shut. And that is pointing most definitely to the idea that space is empty and it's populated by things. And any population would be good. Space is possible to imagine as it is. And I think that is most typical for Newtonian space, which is homogeneous, and you can put whatever you want into that. And I think that sort of reveals the unreality of Newtonian space. The illusion of empty space is a construction by Newton himself, and it gives us the idea that that could be populated. Whatever we make up, we don't have to perceive it. Our perceiving senses are incredibly accurate, but we don't always have conscious access to them. By making them conscious, by trying to imagine what you already know, so to speak, you make awareness, because that space is part and parcel of what is you. And I mentioned before, it's very typical of modern man not to be aware. No primitive culture is not completely aware of its surroundings, and they constantly train that and getting better their whole life, thus making up for lack in physical stature at an old age. They get more accurate in perceiving their reality. And I think that's very typical also of a strong influence on Newtonian space, to say you can just imagine it. For that person, every chair looks the same, every piece of floor is the same, and the empty air is just plain empty, homogeneous, populated by these little pieces of rice that Newton once imagined would populate empty space, and thus making it measurable without a measurer. So you see, this Newtonian space is the only way we perceive of space today. How odd! Construct that has only 300 years to count on its age is already the only way to perceive reality. Well, it's not even reality, it's something you make up yourself. It's your imagination that populates the empty space. That means that you are going to be completely shut out from your body. You will be literally in thin air. You will be transcendental. Space is not separable from what's in it. Space is the things also, not something in between. And if you see distances between different things in your reality, you are deceiving yourself, because that can only happen while you move. Distances are not something permanent, seen by a panopticon from nowhere. Distances is to do with your action. It's a doing. This does not mean it's easy to shield oneself from Newtonian space. Of course it's not. Everybody is doing the same thing. No person you ever met in this world have done it differently. And that goes to show how different the world has done in 300 years. Can you imagine you have never ever in your life had a thought that wasn't Newtonian? You have never ever met anybody whose life is not Newtonian. But still, that does not mean that it is reality. Why does this sound so much like the Matrix? Well, it does sound like the Matrix because the author unintentionally was thinking of Newtonian space. That's my own conviction. I don't need to vouch for that, but it's too close to the real McCoy to be a coincidence, I'd say. But the trick in this matrix is not to take a blue pill. You already know what is real. You need to connect to your body. That is where it starts, and you do that with mind and body together. It needs a bodily training, and that training needs to be specific. We look at human movement as something unspecific because we don't think reality contains information. This is something that we as subject give to reality. Although it's not subjective, we are the measurer. But there's nothing in reality that can give the measure itself. This is the work division we make between the objective world and ourselves. The distances are out there, what we do the measurement. And that means that I cannot be aware of reality in a way. I'm shut out from reality. And this is one of those very, very odd conclusions about the standard model. And that is, you don't have access to reality. You are permanently shut out. Once again, the matrix, although there are some differences, but in this case it is very close. The shutting out we have done ourselves. It's not so hard to understand if you cut off consciousness by the neck and put consciousness in some transcendental sphere which cannot be perceived, cannot be sensed. You have already cut yourself out of reality. And that leads to the idea that reality is something crude, it's not specific. Action do not carry information or knowledge. We are all against the idea of the Swiss engineer Robert Pfeiffer. We all think that motion cannot carry information. I'd say it does, and I'd say that we had an intuitive, implicit knowledge of space as carrier of knowledge. And that movement is knowledge. Look at this. This is how H and J used to look like. And you all think that is a decoration, some sort of supplement. It's not decoration, it's not supplement. This is the essence of the whole thing. The information lies in the construction. That's the only place any knowledge or information can be. I would say we are already at that point of knowledge, understanding. Knowledge is not representation. That model wouldn't work. That has been counted mathematically, computer-wise, and it's been now shown from biology. And I think most relevant in this case is it's been shown from AI. You cannot construct intelligence from the idea of representation. It cannot be done. So we know that knowledge is in the movement, and you have to learn a sort of mental movement and a physical movement, and the physical movement needs to be specific. That's why Western tradition has not developed any physical knowledge movement, not something that has developed during millennia like you see in the East. Reason is, already 500 BC we start shutting that sort of knowledge out. Therefore, nothing such a thing could be constructed. But that doesn't mean we cannot import it, but we need to hone our senses before. We cannot have our stored up mental illusions like identity I mentioned in 783. That cannot be still in our thinking. We need to rid that first. We need to clear that alley. Otherwise, the emotions won't be seen. You won't be able to go into detail into the information. So this will turn into this. Something horrid, not carrier of knowledge. So the whole idea is incredibly crude with Newtonian space, and to say that you just could conjure something, imagine something, is absolute crudeness. That will most probably just be a symbol of something in reality. Reality in itself is incredibly complex. Look at the shades, the tonality, the different structures, the feel to it, the weight to it, the volume. It's just amazing. You cannot imagine that. And to say I can replace that with something in imagination, it's jumping on the Newtonian train. And if you do that, very little matters. You have shut that door to perception and understanding by then. We live in a reality. We have always been here in this reality, and therefore our space is what we have perceived before. Me as a person, and I need to get into that. But there is a fantastic potentiality for discovery here, because in reality we have all these things that is not in the symbolism, in the fantasy, this crude fantasy. We have so much more. It's a depth, it's a surprise, it's always new, it's fresh, it's vibrant, it's colorful. It carries signification, it carries information, and it also carries measurement and guidelines and all those. I am not the only measurer. Reality can measure itself. So our regular knowledge is, in that sense, cut off, like an island cut off from the mainland, with no bridge and shark-filled water in between. This is what we're saying, that reality is measurable, but I am the measurer. I, myself, do the measuring, and therefore I cannot know about the self, what is me, and why it's measured. It cannot know anything about the measuring or the thing measured either. All those things are shut out of knowledge. It's gone. It's at a distance. This is also called technological model, and that accepts the claims that the cells stand at the center of the world, and that it knows it own all experience. That means it's the measurer, but it does not have any way to investigate those claims directly. Why they're done, how they're done. While the culture conditioning of the self, the modification of the self's identity over time, and similar issues are all open to inquiry, the fact of identity itself, to which all knowledge is subordinated, is inaccessible to knowledge. So effectively, we don't know why we measure. And not only that, that is how we state the measuring is something that shuts out the purpose of the measuring. And with the self established at the center of experience, a dichotomy at once emerges. The self finds itself to be separated from the objects that it needs to satisfy its wants. From this basic situation arises desire and momentum directed outward towards possession of what is desired, and from desires come action. Bound up in these subjective patterns, the self works to acquire specific goods available only in the objective realm, using up its mental and physical energy in doing so. As the method for doing this, technology receives special emphasis. And since the technological model for knowledge supports the claims of the self, a cyclical dynamic comes into being, stimulating the ever-increasing production and consumption of goods to satisfy the needs of the self. A constant busyness makes it unlikely that other forms of knowing can arise. This busyness is maybe that clutter mind we have today. Different things constantly drags us out of ourselves, and the not knowing procedure does that. There is no way of knowing why the measuring is done. The intention is not obvious. The intention is embedded, so to speak. It's not gone, however, but it's not accessible to knowledge directly. We can only indirectly, by consuming, for instance, the measurement or whatever we are doing, can we have a little feel of it, but it's very far away at a distance. We can get closer to the experience and actually more in depth perceive what's happening. Well, I think that's a little bit time to round about. It's getting late. The name of the lecture was The Self and Its World, and it's about how we measure the world. And this is partly inspired by the gay science of Nietzsche. It's very interesting. He shows that we are shutting ourselves out of knowledge, and we do no longer acknowledge a fundament for knowledge, like reality, and that we make ourselves the measurer and the thing measured outside ourselves. There will always be a gap between the measurer and what is measured. And this gap is the distance, makes it inaccessible. It's a big boom here. It's something to hit your shoulder at. Okay, I say thank you very much and have a very pleasant evening.